Good evening. My name is Simon Watts, and I'm the Director of the Brighton Observatory. The Brighton Observatory of Environment and Economics is a charity, and our purposes are around facilitating adaptation to climate change in terms of the environment, the economy, and our communities. Okay, the event you are about to see is one of two types of event that we run. This is a speaker event, and this usually occurs in winter for the sort of obvious reason, really, that our other events are field events in the field outside, and they usually occur in summer. It's more popular that way. Why am I talking to you? I need to describe briefly what you're about to see and how it works. So what you're about to see is a Teams meeting, except that some of the speakers in the Teams meeting are physically here at the meeting, and some of them are overseas. One is in northwest Canada, for instance, this evening, and another one is in the UK, and there's also a contributor from Auckland. The structure of the evening: each speaker nominally talks for about 10 minutes, and the title of this event is "What Does Adaptation Look Like on the Ground?" There are 4 speakers, so after 40 minutes or so there's a break for hot chocolate, although in this particular event we run over slightly, so this break occurs after the 3rd speaker, but nonetheless. Then all the speakers, including somebody who did not speak, form a panel to address questions from the audience which have been taken live and ranked using Slido. I should explain why we have a panel member who is not a speaker. One of the speakers, Jonathan Cassian, represents a UK insurance company. Why we've asked him to speak this evening will become apparent. However, we understood and predicted that such a session would spark insurance questions from the New Zealand audience. All of the audience for this are physically present, and therefore the geography is important. So we asked IAG, New Zealand Insurance Company executive, whether he would be prepared to be on the panel to help field those questions. Okay, so the speakers this evening are Paul Zana, Jonathan Cassian, and the Honourable Dr. Megan Woods. The 4th speaker, Kate Kipling, unfortunately was unwell. She has COVID, unfortunately. She is from the UK Environment Agency, and late in the piece she had to withdraw from this particular session. So we are very grateful and thankful that Andrew Eden, who is the research manager for the Environment Agency of England, stepped in at the last moment, and he became the 4th speaker. A summary of his bio appears on the screen. And as I'd already mentioned, Bryce Davis, he is the Executive Manager Corporate Relations for IAG, also agreed to step in to be part of the panel to address New Zealand insurance questions which may arise. And again, there's a sort of mini bio of him on the screen. So the session runs, and in the panel session various questions are asked. There's no screening. We use Slido, which means the audience themselves ask the questions and then can vote on them to either make them close to the top of the list or close to the bottom of the list. We don't interfere with that, and the order of questions asked follows that which you'll see on the next few screens. And again, this is a video, so you can come back and look at these. We basically started at the top and worked our way down. There were quite a lot of questions, which we see as being a good thing. And we probably only got through maybe 7 or 8 of these questions. But these are here for completeness so that you can appreciate and maybe feel how the evening went. Now, after you've watched this video, it may be that you have questions. I would refer you to our webpage. That's www.boee.nz, or email us at info@boee.nz, and we will seek to address your questions. And the final slide from this sequence is the word cloud that came from the questions. It's something we do which we find interesting. Anyhow, that's the end of me. So again, thank you to all the speakers, the participants, and the audience for what turned out to be a very interesting evening. As we go into the video, it seems, for various circumstances not entirely within our control, we have lost the first few minutes of the presentation by Megan Woods, for which I apologise. However, what remains is very powerful anyway. Okay, let's go.
Reform, and this piece of legislation was to be the third leg of it. But I am pleased that we have been able to come together to say that we will work across all the parties in Parliament to look at what we can do to put in place the policy framework where we can have some form of consensus. We're at the moment, we're hearing submissions. The Environment Committee called for submissions and received submissions, but they were never heard. But one of the things that we've made sure that we're doing on the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee is that we're now going back through all those submissions that were received from the Environment Inquiry. So if anyone submitted on that, don't worry, your submission's not languishing somewhere gathering dust. It is something that we are utilising as well. I actually suggested to the Minister of Climate Change, also called Simon Watts, that we should have this inquiry at Finance and Expenditure. It wasn't just to make my life easier and that I sat on FEC, but I thought it was absolutely vital that we had Treasury engaged in doing the policy work from the very beginning, that they didn't just come in at the end with a critique of what the Ministry for the Environment said. We needed them at the table, and we needed them to be active participants in bringing together the thinking, and also to have advisors from Treasury sitting through and hearing all the submissions as well. So if we think about what the size of the problem is, well, we know, and everybody in this room knows, and I'm very pleased to be in a room where I don't have to convince anyone about that climate change is real, and that we're seeing the intensification of damage and the economic cost from both extreme weather events and gradual changes over recent years. And I think that's really important, that it's not only the extreme events that capture the media attention and everybody focuses on, but we are seeing a lot of gradual change that is eroding viability of some core infrastructure and how it is that we're going to deal with that. But what we do know is 30% of damages from the 12 worst flood events in New Zealand from 2007 to 17 were directly attributable to climate change. The costs of weather events to the land transport network have increased in the last 10 years from about $20 million a year to over $90 million a year. And it's also likely that we'll see these numbers increase given the high proportion of New Zealanders living in areas susceptible to increasing natural hazard risk. And that potential includes 750,000 New Zealanders and 500,000 buildings worth over 145 billion that are near rivers and in coastal areas already exposed to extreme flooding. So that's just what's already in the firing line. There's around $14 billion of local government-owned infrastructure at risk from sea level rise, and nationally 1% of houses are exposed to increased flooding from climate change, and 80% of those, about 4,300, are in areas of high deprivation and high Māori populations. So we can see this is a massive problem. You can see why it is one of those very complex public policy issues that keeps many people awake at night. To date, and we'll hear much more about that from Paul, but so much of what we have done as a country in terms of climate adaptation, we have approached from a natural disaster response and recovery framework, that we've lent so heavily on those structures that we've had. It's not dissimilar to how we would respond to an earthquake, that it's the same set of legislation that kicks in. We need a far more proactive approach, because when we're leaning so heavily on disaster response and recovery approaches, we're only doing stuff after the fact. We're not trying to get ahead of it. The new reality of climate change is increasingly straining that system and the systems governing our built environment and the stability of housing, finance and insurance markets. Becoming more resilient in the face of our changing climate requires us to have a very clear view of the costs and risks created by these natural hazards. Sharing responsibility in addressing these risks and the costs they grow will require strengthening the tools and the frameworks that we currently have at our disposal to make them fit for purpose for the challenges that we have ahead of us. Local government has a number of statutory responsibilities for managing natural hazards and, by extension, the risks that arise from those hazards. And I'm going to read you some of the legislation that governs this, and it's not to bore you with a list of statutes. It's really to make the point that it is so far from clear exactly what that framework looks like. So under Section 30 of the Resource Management Act, regional councils have the function of controlling land use for the purposes of the avoidance or mitigation of natural hazards. Under Section 31, territorial authorities have the function of controlling any actual or potential effects of the use, development or protection of land, including for the purposes of the avoidance or mitigation of natural hazards. Under the Soil and Conservation and Rivers Control Act of 1941, councils have powers and duties to undertake works to protect properties from floods. Under the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act of 2002, councils must work together in groups to manage hazards and risks through their local CDM or civil defence plans and share post-event recovery costs with central government in accordance with that plan. Furthermore, the Local Government Act sets out the processes for the provision of infrastructure and other local government spending. Councils must produce 30-year infrastructure strategies which set out the approach to managing new and existing assets over time and must identify and manage risks relating. So you can see the tapestry, some of it in legislation that goes back to the 1940s. This is not fit for purpose. And it's not just government. There are obviously a whole set of other players, including individuals, that have responsibility to manage risk in there. For example, a key tool for individuals choosing to manage the risks they face is insurance. And we're going to hear some of that tonight about the central place that insurance plays in this. And one of the organisations we're hearing a lot from at the moment is from the Insurance Council and talking with them about it. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from them tonight. But there are a number of existing flaws in that existing system, which climate change will exacerbate. And these include, among many, there's a very long list, there's strong incentives for development in at-risk areas with only high-level legislative support for comprehensive consideration of all the adaptation options. And I think we will see that even more and more. And this is, Paul and I were talking about the intersection of urban development legislation and plans that governments have as we have pressures on councils to produce their 30-year plans around housing, the temptation to allow for development in areas where, if you're looking at it through a climate lens, it shouldn't happen, may prove far too tempting. There are overlapping roles and responsibilities, not surprising when you've got such a patchwork of legislation, and there's, fair to say, a fair amount of ambiguity about exactly who must pay for what. And I think that brings us to the nub of one of the central issues that we have to work through. And this is exacerbated by long-standing underinvestment in infrastructure from both central and local government in New Zealand. There's also problems with the use of risk of information, so with the data, who can access what. and how it is that we can share data. And insurers are also concerned at the rising losses attributable to climate change and really are looking for governments to provide leadership at a national level around risk. It's one of the reasons why New Zealand, for such a seismically active country, has the ability to insure against earthquakes. I know when I was the Minister for the Earthquake Commission visiting the reinsurers in London and in Germany, they all saw New Zealand as rock solid because we had their earthquake commission sitting behind. It's effectively a government underwrite there. So the House has asked the committee to conduct an inquiry into climate adaptation. We're looking at a range of objectives, and some of you will have already submitted on it, but we've been asked to consider the following topics: the nature of the climate adaptation problem New Zealand faces, the frameworks for investment and cost sharing, and the roles and responsibility. And then there's some catch-alls about anything else we see fit. We're due to report back by the 5th of December. I am aware we're at the end of July. I wouldn't be surprised if we have to push that out a little bit. But the key issues that are coming up, as I said, and it's the one that I think that sits right in the middle of this Gordian knot, and it's who pays for what? What are the cost-sharing arrangements? For me, I think we need to concentrate on 4 core allocative principles when we're considering this. We could look at a public pays principles that holds that the cost of adaptation should fall generally on taxpayers or ratepayers. Another way is the beneficiary pays principle that holds that the cost of producing goods should be borne by those who benefit from the goods. Then there's a polluter pays principle that holds that those that contribute to climate change and or maladaptation should bear the costs of managing it. And then there's the ability to pay principle as the 4th one. And I think they're probably the 4 kind of ways in which we need to think about this. But in reality, I think any approach that we put together is not going to land on just one. It is going to be a combination of all of those. We've already looked in New Zealand for a brief period of time at the polluter pays principle. So when we were using through the climate emergency response, I am winding up, through the climate emergency response fund, that one of the things that we were recycling the money from the emissions trading scheme back into initiatives around climate adaptation. And in fact, the work that Paul is undertaking, he'll talk to you about, was funded through money from the emissions trading scheme. And that falls very clearly in the polluter pays. I guess if I'm going to use the diplomatic language, that fund is not currently being progressed by the current government. That money has been returned to the general coffers. And we see internationally, and I won't go into those examples, there are a range of people that are falling on the side of the polluter pays. We've seen New York is doing some interesting things around that and a number of others. But the key themes: role clarity, data access, how to engage with local communities, and I know Paul's going to talk about that, how it is that we work between central and local government, the devolving of decision making. But I think we can talk all we want about the devolving of decision making, but it will mean nothing if we do not come to some solid recommendations about who pays for what. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please note, Slido, people are asking questions. Do ask. Thank you, Megan. That was wonderful. Paul, can I ask you? Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I had the option of going first today, and I should have taken it rather than going after a seasoned speaker, to be honest. Kia ora, my name's Paul Zarnan. For those that don't know me, I once referred to myself as a local in New Brighton, and to be honest, I still do. So this was home for a long time for me and my family, and every time we come back over the bridge, it honestly still feels like home. So it's lovely to be back here, and a quick acknowledgement to some of the people in the room who taught me a lot of what I know, and I'll be repeating it back to them this evening. So I've had a really, really fortunate career to date. I've worked in NGOs, I've worked in the private sector, I've worked for government agencies, I'm currently on a secondment role to the Buller District Council and to the Resilient Westport Steering Group. So they're overseeing a whole tranche of work that's Crown agencies, District Council and Regional Council together. So my role tends to find me sitting dead smack in the middle of the private sector, communities and government agencies. So I'm constantly holding this translator role between different parties. Some people refer to it as honest brokerage, but I'd like to consider it a translatory role. So I've questioned myself over the last couple of weeks when Simon gave me the invite, what have I got to provide here? I'm not a climate scientist, I'm not a policy analyst, I certainly don't make decisions at a high level, but I've had thousands, if not tens of thousands of conversations with people at grassroots level. And that's something I think tonight I'd like to take the opportunity to share some of those learnings. Why do we constantly end up in a fist fight where the Crown's going the same intentions, councils are going the same intentions, and so are communities? We're all looking for betterment, and yet at the same time, we end up in a fight. So I'll take tonight as an opportunity for some of those learnings and to share them with you. So currently, I am the project lead for Master Planning Westport. It's a really unique platform for us to work from. It actually came out of the 21 and 22 floods. So Westport isn't new to hazards. It's got an amazing hazard stack from liquefaction, fluvial flooding. It's got pluvial liquefaction, storm surges. It's got isolation and fault lines, partnered with economic boom and bust cycles as well. Next on the list will be plagues and comet strikes at some stage, no doubt. So in 21 and 22, 25% of Westport's housing stock got a hit. So a quarter of Westport got really bad flooding, enough for people to have to move out of their homes. Circa $150 million to $200 million worth of damage happened over those two events. So a plea was made to government at the time from the district and the regional council and said, we need help. We need protection measures around Westport. So essentially 16 kilometres of ring bank around Westport. So the government of the day, Mr. Woods, wrote back to the regional and district council and said, that's lovely, do better. So how are you going to address the rest of these hazards? We'll give you the money for the flood walls, but we want to see you come back with a cohesive plan. So at that point, we authored the Kawateri business case, and that looked at a multi-pronged approach, or the PARA framework as we refer to it. So PARA stands for protect, avoid, retreat, always a touchy subject, and accommodate of the hazard. So protection, reasonably simple, you ring bank the place and you're underway. The avoidance of the hazards is around future zoning and infrastructure provision. So where can we encourage and incentivize activity to occur that actually removes it from the hazard over a period of time? Retreat. This is a really, really gnarly one. And I want to make it really clear that as of today, managed retreat in New Zealand is not a thing. There is no such thing as managed retreat. At the moment, the best that we have is a disaster response. You wait to get a hit, you take your insurance money and your EQC capital, and you move somewhere else. That is our version of retreat in New Zealand. And then there's accommodate. So that's stormwater management, foundation typologies, building up on piles, getting finished floor heights up, and that sort of intervention. So out of this framework, series of budget line items came through. I'm not going to spend too much time on the protection, but it is interrelated to the rest of the work program. So my project sits in the avoidance and the retreat part of the conversation. When we first started looking at it, we looked at a spatial plan. So essentially, we're going to draw up some new subdivisions and see what would happen. When we started scratching the surface of trying to understand Westport and realized that there is this plethora of hazards and a strong history. There's even a book about it called The Struggle for Survival. That's Westport's history. So we looked at it and went, a spatial plan is going to achieve nothing. So we elevated the thinking up and we went, what does this look like if we start referring to it as master planning? Sits at a high level and looks at all elements of community development, including zoning and the building of houses. So we really turned it on its head. We zoomed out, we blew out the geographical area on the understanding that a community is a sum of many, many parts rather than just a defined area as such. And we started the term master planning at that point. It's a really, really important to note that the reason we did this is we believe that adaptation comes from community development or betterment as the foundation to have the conversation from. rather than a hazard response. That was a fundamental shift in how we started the conversation. We broke the project up into 3 stages quite deliberately. So stage 1 was foundation setting. It was appointing a project team. It was bringing subject matter experts to the table. But the really important note was what we did on ground. So we thought it was important that we had government and governance approval. We had executive approval from both councils. But we thought the most important part was getting a social license to operate. So that's what we spent a lot of time doing, is working within the community, brewing an understanding in the community about what the conversation was about and how we were going to work together on it. So stage 1 was really foundation setting for the entire work project. We've recently moved into stage 2, where the proper planning starts kicking in. So we've got landscape architects, urban designers, civil engineers, etc., starting to work with us. And we set up a stakeholder reference group with 180 locals on it. People that hate councils, people that love councils, Facebook protagonists, young, old, and everything in between. We wanted a litmus test of that community to run alongside us. So I've had a series of workshops. Tomorrow, going home super early because we've got 4 days of back-to-back workshops. This is design week 3. Now, the previous 2 design workshops, because of that social license, because of that foundation work, we had unanimous support in both workshops. And we're not avoiding the tough conversations at all, but the how of having these conversations is really, really important. Hey, Rach. Lessons learned. So tomorrow we start spatial planning with our community. This is the first time we really start looking at where do we move. Important part of how we move there, we will continue working with government agencies over time to try and address that. But at the moment, we don't have that luxury. So we're going to start opening areas up for growth, but they can double down as a retreat area post-event if so required, much similar to what Selwyn was to the residential red zone in Christchurch. Right. So one of the big lessons that I've learned in my tens and thousands of conversations around this is nobody responds to threat well. A fight or flight instinct begins to kick in. Communities are no different in that space. So you start taking hazard maps, telling everybody they're doomed and gloomed, then you will get a fight or flight response every single time. So we're anchoring our project in hope and choice. It's a much better way to have a conversation about people's futures. After all, this is people's homes, not houses we're talking about. It's where they've raised their children, it's where they've buried their dogs, it's where they know their neighbours, it's their communities that this conversation anchors around. So, to that point around community development, we've even developed a community or wellbeing compass. This will hold us true through the planning phase, but it also gives us something to measure success by. So I've gone off the community and created many different elements of this compass, and they're still anchored in the wellbeings, but it has been localized to Westport. This is a plan for Westport and by Westport. And to steal one of the local adages of Christchurch, nothing about us without us. I think a core part of the planning issues in relation to hazard responses is that we are planning for the worst and hoping for the best. Where I firmly believe we need to plan for the best and plan for the worst. We do, of course, use best practice, IAP2 spectrum of engagement, MFE guidance on community engagement, relevant policy settings of government of the day, and international studies on adaptation and engagement. However, every single time we've had to twist it and localize it. So I see it too many times that a project goes out and follows step 1 through to 10 and expects it to hit home in different communities and with different people. So to date, the engagement's been going incredibly well. We'll see how the next week goes, Brad. I've got high hopes, mate. So stage 2 will see us develop a holistic roadmap, something that covers all the well-beings of our community, including our hazard response over time. These will be short, mid, and long-term interventions, and they will get vaguer over time because there will be review processes. Stage 3, which is the final stage, goes on in perpetuity. That's about enactioning and enabling the plan. As the Minister said as well, these are expensive. So we still need to work with Crown agency partners to figure out how we're going to pay for this. Westport, like many other places, has a historic underinvestment in current infrastructure. So there's a catch up while we're trying to establish new and seize opportunities as well. So the master plan at high level, it traverses subject and time. It's intergenerational and it will adapt to the challenges, but it firmly has to look at the opportunities for our community in this space. Excuse me. Climate change and climate adaptation require us to look into every element of our lives, from ideological principles through to financial. It challenges the assumptions on the way that we live. It's a conversation worth having with our communities and arguably one that we should be having as a nation. Do we have a vision for the future, and are we marching to the beat of the appropriate drum? So there's a couple of key lessons that I do want to take away for any practitioners in the room. Gain a social license to undertake your work. Governance and executive approval mean nothing if the community does not stand behind these plans. The how of engagement is just as important as the what or the why. Take your time. These things can't be done quickly. This is people's lives and livelihoods we're talking about. Understand the issues, set your scope appropriately, but most importantly, look for the opportunities. Be very honest in these projects about what can and cannot be done, but do not back down. If policy or legislation needs to change, it can. Never, ever, ever just approach the hazards. Nobody wants to talk about doom and gloom. You have to find a way to have an iterative and meaningful conversation with communities. Never, ever speak down to communities. This is something I see in the public sector. We'll write it for a 10-year-old. You're not dealing with 10-year-olds. Just because people are busy in their own lives doesn't mean they can't understand. But importantly, the conversation is a two-way one. And quite often I see the public sector talking to rather than with, and certainly not listening. And individuals and communities, real or perceived, individuals and communities under threat, real or perceived, will engage in a fight or flight response. Every single time. If you threaten a community, a fight or flight response will kick in. So hopefully I've provided something semi-useful tonight. Keep an eye on Westport. We're doing really well. And happy planning, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Pardon me. Okay, the next speaker is not physically here. He is currently flying from northwest Canada, and he thought it might be a little difficult to address this conference from there. So instead, we had a Teams meeting, and I apologize for the very ugly face on there. And the result, it's about 14 minutes of that, is the next presentation. Etty?
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for A, hosting the event, and B, allowing me to record a session because, yes, I'm sort of back visiting family for the summer, and unfortunately when you're holding your session we'll be in transit back, but glad to be able to join you this way.
And please don't talk about summer. New Zealand is in the midst of winter, so we'll be jealous. Anyway, over to you.
Well, London is in the midst of a kind of, I think, 18-degree and rainy summer. So so that's what I probably should have as my background at that moment. But I'm here in Canada, so glad to be joining you this way. And maybe I'll just jump right into it and try to kind of get through. I tried to focus really on some of the really specific and tangible things that FloodRe is doing. But first, a little bit of context about FloodRe, rather than kind of explaining all the things about how the scheme works, aside from saying we are a reinsurance scheme that is like the money comes from the industry through a levy on the insurers, and we operate as a facility that insurers could use. It isn't mandatory that they use us, but ultimately through our existence, a number of places in the UK that had gone through major flooding events and were unable to get insurance the way you're starting to see in places like the United States right now. We're able to now, we track it quarterly, and basically everybody can get insurance. The prices are fairly reasonable, a small premium for flood risk or flood claim, or, you know, a premium, but not the kinds of thousands of pounds premiums that you saw previously or that you're seeing now in dollars in the US. Floodry, as I said, is a public-private partnership. Government sets the rules for the scheme, and insurers ultimately are both the funders and, to some degree, the beneficiaries. And so we operate with a fairly wide spectrum, collaborating with those partners as well as sort of the Environment Agency, DEFRA, community partners, quite a few. And I emphasize the partnership aspect because you'll see when we get to some of the things that we're working on, they're almost all in partnership. We, you know, there's one that we, to some degree, did on our own, which is at the end, but most of these are really very embedded in a network that tries to develop evidence for government to use, but also make practical outputs for insurers. Okay, next slide. Yes. So every 5 years we publish a transition plan, and as part of that, we've looked at what are the factors that are affecting risks in the UK. Really broadly, those are the big picture things: spending on flood defenses, what's happening with climate change, and planning, so building of homes in areas of flood risk. So that's the big picture stuff that largely is controlled by central government, and we try to, you know, advise on, influence on where we can, but is largely a level well above us. Where we're really targeted is actually reducing the damage and costs of flooding. So what can you do if those floods do happen, if an area is undefended, if an event is too big to be able to manage, or, you know, increasingly in the case of surface water flooding, flash flooding, what if, you know, the water doesn't absorb and affects homes downhill. So we really are focused on protecting homes at the home level. That's something that wasn't done a huge amount before, and we're quite targeted there. And then there's the achieving an effective market, and that's where we kind of work with our insurance partners to make sure that A, you know, things are being reflected in flood models, that B, there's kind of you know, people can get insurance, and they can, but the flood scheme, I should say, all this is because the flood scheme stops existing in 2039. So we have a mandate not just to make sure that things are okay today, but so that we're fixing the problem so that when we exit, there isn't some sort of kind of a cliff edge. So as part of our transition plan, we identified, what do we need to do? These are our commitments that we made kind of last year, expect to see playing out over the next 5 years. I've talked a little bit, you know, I think I'll talk really in particular about the things that we are undertaking. So it's basically a nexus of flood performance certificates, a scoring methodology for property flood resilience, and what is called a center of excellence on this slide, as was in 2023, is now called our flood and insurance hub. So I'll really try to get into that, and then I'll touch on flood awareness. So Build Back Better is our flagship program, and the basic principle of it was, when you rebuild a home, instead of rebuilding it exactly the way it was, you rebuild with flood measures. Property level flood resilience measures, you know, doors, windows, non-permeable surfaces inside, elevated sockets, pumps, things that will either keep the water out, help you get small amounts of water out, or prevent damage if a small amount of water gets in. So we provide, because we are a scheme which pools capital from the insurance sector, we have, you know, we are able to provide an extra £10,000 towards the rebuilding of any property with these flood measures. And that launched in 2022. 2023, we saw, was the first real year of operation of that, and this winter has been our first real test of that. What we're seeing is that only about 30% of homes have taken up those measures. and it's a bit higher. So the Environment Agency goes to places, and there are government schemes to do this, house by house, individual by individual, going through the entire neighborhood, and they typically get more like 50%. This was our first year of operation. It's quite new. It's quite a new thing for people, so we're not surprised or crestfallen that 30%, only 30% are taking it up. We have targets to improve that year over year. But the reasons people aren't doing it is it takes a little bit longer to get the products, sometimes comfortable with something new. And the big thing that we've really honed in on is the time for a conversation about something new isn't when someone is under duress, when they've gone through an extraordinarily stressful period and they've been flooded, they're out of their home, they just want to get back in. It's not, they have to be on board to some degree before. So that's why we really work on awareness, which I'll come to a little bit. But the positive is that a large part of the industry, so 70 to 75% of the industry is now offering it. So it's out there, it's getting deployed throughout the industry. More and more people will have the opportunity to take this up, and we hope that things that we do will help more and more people to take it up, because it's kind of a game changer. It's so logical that you would do this. If you're in a place that's going to flood over and over, you want to be protected for the next time. You don't want to just be rebuilding and flooding and rebuilding and flooding. It's a way to break that cycle. But also those measures are relatively new. So there isn't a detailed metric on what all of them achieve. So we've set about working with academic partners, the Environment Agency, on one of their schemes where they go through the neighborhood, and actually one that achieved really high uptake. I think it was above 70%. And look at what those measures are achieving, do what are called loss damage curves. So if the water is X deep, the measure will protect you to X level, and the resulting damage will be down by a certain amount. So it's basically working through the technical considerations that can be used by insurers, used by, or even tell the homeowner what level of protection they have. So this is fairly new. It's a new type of methodology, but loss damage curves are well established in the insurance industry, but this is basically for this new type of home building, what are different combinations of measures achieving on different topologies of homes. So we've done it for a couple, and the next phase of the project is to look at sample kinds of homes from across the UK. There are quite a few common types, and trying to now develop those curves for those different home types with different sorts of measures to try to kind of help the industry to get out the most appropriate, be able to advise on the most appropriate measures, and also track what it's going to do, because sometimes homeowners are not aware of it. And that brings us to flood performance certificates. So over here, we have something called energy performance certificates, and those are basically with every home, you have different, you get a report, a single page, quite a graphic that says you are an A, B, C, D, E. You have good energy efficiency, and it's a standard product that is required for every home as part of the sale process, part of the rental process. So there isn't something similar for flood, and we are working towards that. And so that scoring methodology for PFR will underpin that, but the flood performance certificate will be essentially the consumer-facing piece of that. And because currently some homes are sold with PFR in them that people are unaware of what's happening, unaware of what they have in their home, this will basically standardize that information and that information transfer. We want to, so our Homes Flood and Insurance Hub, that kind of third point in the triangle that I mentioned, is basically going to develop the academic standards, a wet testing environment to be able to really test those methodologies with actual water rather than waiting to see what a flood does, and really kind of square the circle and be able to level up that information generation process. So I realize I'm running short on time, so I'll kind of jump through this, but basically those three are the kind of, intersections of what we think will develop relevant, solid methodology that also makes it accessible for the homeowner. what are we doing on awareness? So this year was about 2 months ago, we did a flood resilient garden at the Chelsea Flower Show, which is a huge event in the UK, gets national coverage. Really required colleagues to go, like this was our comms team who went outside the box and said, let's do something that could land with the public. Because when we talk flooding, it doesn't, really land with the public in quite the way you would hope. And, unsurprisingly, right? But they decided to go for this. It was quite a big endeavor. But it actually just was so much more successful than we could have ever hoped for, because what we had was the BBC on day one reporting the news from there. All the BBC presenters came by, Channel 4, all the major international papers. So there were features on this in just about every newspaper. Features went international. The evening news, the kind of famous garden show presenters, came by, filmed segments there. So what we thought was kind of a risk just turned into an absolute win in terms of consumer engagement. And you know how you do a metric that is about reach, and that metric is a newspaper, let's say the Mail Online, reaches 2 million people in a day. Then your reach metric is 2 million. So a good reach metric for us is in the millions. The reach metric for this was 2.8 billion. Obviously that is a certain derived number. It's a bit, but what it shows is I think something like 1,000-fold, over our target, and or 10-fold over our target in some of these cases. So this was something that really landed awareness of flooding in a completely different way, and we're really proud of it. We're really glad to have that happen, and it's something we really want to build on. It's gotten that discussion in, not only it's already in the financial areas because of what's happening in the US with de-insurance of certain states, but this also started to raise it in the popular mind in a kind of a different way, and really has resonated, at least for this year. And so this is kind of a good period that we really want to build on it, because I think the message we wanted to show is you as a homeowner, as the person doing your garden, actually can do things to hold more water. I won't go through it all, but there's several water retention features as part of this. And you can do something that is beautiful, that uses water, prevents drought, and kind of works with the climate, and is ultimately applied climate adaptation for those who have a yard and are into these sorts of things. So those are a few. That's kind of our academic, our business, and our popular view. But I think I've covered, hopefully, a couple of useful examples. And I don't know, Simon, if you've got any questions that you think the audience would be interested in, or we can, yeah.
No, I think I won't bias the audience in that, but I'd really appreciate you taking time out from your family holiday to do this, Jonathan. And we'll be in touch later. Anyway,
great.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to anyone who's joining.
Turn the recording off. Yeah.
Okay, guys, clocks are very restrained things. And we have moved. What I'm going to suggest we do is we have one more speaker. I'm going to suggest that people gravitate toward the hot chocolate and biscuits, grab that and bring it back to your seat. And then we'll start with the last presentation before we go into the panel session. And please do keep an eye on I always called it Slido. And you can interact and you can up or down any of those questions I ask you. Anyway, so yes, please help yourself to chocolate and biscuits. And we'll aim to start again as quickly as we can without killing each other. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to drift back to your seats with something better than Brownian motion. Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, our next speaker is, our final speaker, is the research manager for the Environment Agency of England in the United Kingdom. And hopefully our communication, welcome.
Hello, hopefully you can all hear me okay. Let's just check that first off.
We can. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Over to you.
No problem. Okay, I'm just going to get my screen set up so we can see the presentation. So firstly, a big thank you for inviting me to speak, and apologies that my colleague Kate Kipling can't attend. So my name's Andy Eden and I work for the Environment Agency. I wanted to sort of present on the sort of adaptation and resilience components to the Environment Agency's work. I primarily focus on strategy and the translation of science and innovation into practical guidance. So essentially making it easier for practitioners to take action on climate adaptation. So I'm going to share some things about the role of the Environment Agency in this kind of resilience and adaptation space, but also some of the practical actions that have been taken by the Environment Agency and local communities to make sure their places are resilient to flooding and coastal change. But first off, let's start off with the context. The climate is changing faster than we can adapt. 2023 was the warmest year on record ever. Sea level rise, frequency of high intensity rainfall and flooding, they're all increasing. And just to provide a English context here, by 2100, sea levels in London are likely to be 1 metre higher than they are today. So put simply, it's not possible to be able to protect everywhere with ever bigger, larger and costly flood and coastal defences. So there is a question mark there about how we can make sure that our people and places are resilient to the worst of these impacts. So a bit about what the Environment Agency does. We're essentially a non-departmental public body, which means we're sort of separate from government, but connected to it. And we play a crucial role in tackling climate resilience. We're the largest environmental regulator in Europe with about 12,000 employees, and we're also the main responder to environmental incidents. We own around £26 billion worth of flood and coastal defence infrastructure. And one of our core priorities is to increase the resilience of people, property and businesses to the risks of flooding and coastal erosion. So as a government agency, we wear many different hats. We're a delivery partner, we're a regulator, we're an infrastructure operator, and we're a trusted advisor on new development and infrastructure. One of the things that we do carry out is really detailed data and risk mapping of current and future flood and coastal risks for the country. And put it bluntly, data and risk mapping underpins everything that we do. We invest heavily in national modelling of flood and coastal erosion risk, and that's available to all. We also advise government on what the optimal investment mix should be in flood and coastal risk management, and currently that stands at around £1 billion worth of investment every year just to keep pace with climate change. And we also have a duty to advise on new development and infrastructure projects to make sure that climate resilience is built in. One of the things that we also do is provide a strategic overview to flood and coastal erosion risk management for the country, and that sets the national direction for risk management authorities, but also those actors working in the flood and coastal erosion risk space. And in 2020, we signalled a bit of a shift from our national flood and coastal risk management strategy from this narrow focus on flood protection to a concept of resilience, recognising that flood and coastal erosion risk management requires a basket of measures. And the aim of that strategy was to create a nation that's ready for, resilient to flooding and coastal change, both today, tomorrow, and also to the year 2100. So the central tenet of this was to try and make sure that flood defences remain vitally important, but the role of other actions like natural flood management, like flood warning, development planning, innovation, all play a part in reducing damages to people and places. Now, we define resilience as the capacity of people and places to better plan, better protect, respond, and recover quickly from flooding and coastal change. These are the 4 components of resilience towards the bottom of the slide. And whilst we're doing that, we also need to keep one eye on what the climate's doing. So how do we need to adapt our efforts as we sort of feel the brunt of climate impacts? To make our communities resilient and able to adapt to climate change, we need to do things differently. We need to innovate. So 4 years ago, I led a bid with colleagues in our Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to set up a flood and coastal innovation programme. And this was essentially £200 million, which we divested into 3 separate programmes focusing on building the resilience of local places, looking at adaptation plans in 5 strategic geographies across the country, but also tackling the knotty challenge of coastal transition. How do we fund rollback of communities from coastal erosion? So my team lead this single biggest investment in innovation that we have as the Environment Agency, and it's all centred on trying to develop new ways to make a nation resilient to flooding and coastal change. So our projects are delivering nature-based solutions to slow the flow. They're also using artificial intelligence to issue automated flood warnings and automated storm management. They're installing green-blue infrastructure in urban places to manage surface water flood risk. We're also developing financial mechanisms to fund flood resilience through habitat creation, but also encouraging the rollback of communities from an eroding coast using alternative financial mechanisms. And we're also very focused on the role of communities in building all of that. And I'll come on to that in a minute. I will provide some links after the presentation to find more about this sort of set of innovation programs. They truly are transformational. So I wanted to focus a little bit on community engagement and local leadership. One of the key bits of learning from our flood and coastal innovation programs so far has been the importance of local action and basically incorporating communities into the decision making of what flood and coastal resilience actions they should take in their place. And through our adaptation pathways program in particular, we have actually trialed and developed this concept of community panels or citizens' juries. The idea is essentially to bring local people together that are in communities that are affected by flooding and coastal change, to examine the current and future issues that might be affecting them and arrive at a consensus on a plan, a way forward. And community juries have to arrive at that place. They have to arrive there by consensus. So they're there to essentially give local people a voice, find out what matters to their community, and then include them in the decision making about what should be taken forward. So it's similar to the idea from Paul to get a social license, if you like, to operate. Some of the ways that we're using this information is to make sure that the local authorities, the local government that are responsible for looking at flood and coastal risk management locally have that kind of community sense check about what's important to them, and they can use that information to then look at what investment they take forward in flood and coastal risk management, where their priorities might be. So it's a hugely important exercise in how to have an honest conversation about future flooding and coastal change, but then get the sense check from the community about what's important to them. Moving to the left of the slides, I think there's also a real power in local leadership. Through our Coastwise project in North Norfolk, which is tackling that knotty challenge of how do we transition away from an eroding coast? How do we make sure our communities can remain thriving and resilient? The community have actually employed the use of councillors and national media to draw attention to the eroding coastline, to draw attention to this sort of plight of this stretch of the North Norfolk coast, where in some instances they can lose between 7 and 10 metres of shoreline in any single sort of storm event, with average erosion rates of about 2 metres per year. But they're using this kind of local leadership and local power to essentially amplify local issues beyond the community. And they've had a lot of success in one of our national programs, Country File, sort of encouraging people to sort of engage with the fact that the coast is changing all the time and has done over millennia. And just getting the reality out there of some of the people that are literally losing their homes to coastal erosion and transition. One of the things I also want to focus on is knowing what might be coming. This is about making sure that we have a good understanding of what climate change impacts might be coming on the future and what that means for flooding and what that means for coastal erosion. I've already mentioned that the Environment Agency invest heavily in national maps of flood risk. We have maps for surface water, we have maps for river flooding, we have maps for coastal flooding, and also maps of coastal erosion risk across the country. And whilst we do generally have local detail models which take into account climate change, we haven't yet got that picture at the national level of future climate change impacts that people can access freely. However, that is changing, and in the next year we are going to see this rollout of future flood and coastal erosion risk for the entire country, which is available at a local level. So the way our maps work is that public, developers, whoever it might be, can type in a grid reference, a postcode, and get specific information to a particular area on their current and future, soon to be future, flooding and coastal erosion risk from all sources of flooding and coastal change. I say all sources, it doesn't currently incorporate groundwater, but maybe it will in the future. But this is really important because we need to be honest about what those future flooding coastal erosion impacts might be. Even though it is a difficult topic and a sensitive topic, I think sometimes it's better to actually have that information available and encourage that conversation. So people will soon be able to see what their future risk is going into the future. I wanted to also draw attention to the top right of the slide. Through our innovation program, we're experimenting with different ways of engaging with the communities on different ways of getting them, dare I say, accepting the fact that coastal erosion has changed, that has been changed in the local places. And through our Coastal Change Time Machine, which is sort of a unit that can be picked up and put into different exhibition spaces locally, they've used libraries of previous historical imagery at the coast showing a particular point in time, maybe 100 years ago, and then used that information to show how it's changed to the present day. But using projections of climate change, of sediment movement, of future sea level rise, they're able to then plot what that might look like in the future using 3D rendering. And that's been really transformational in trying to encourage communities to accept that actually your coast isn't a static thing. Your coast has changed even within the last 100 years. And that's helping to help communities accept that coastal transition is a thing they're dealing with right now, that coastal erosion is a thing that's happened in the past. And it, again, just encourages that kind of proactive conversation with communities that, okay, we know it's there, let's do something about it. There are also ways that communities can bolster their resilience to flooding and coastal change through individual actions. So moving from left to right across the slides, I've incorporated some images from the Flood Hub website, which is actually a website which provides all sorts of information on flooding and coastal change to encourage local action by communities, looking at sort of property flood resilience measures, how to sign up to flood warnings, how to set up flood action groups, who's responsible for flood and coastal risk management at a local level. And this has been really successful in the northwest of England through one of our regional flood and coastal committees that funded it as a way of encouraging greater buy-in and greater understanding of what agency people have in their own management of current and future flood and coastal erosion risk. In the top middle, we also have the National Flood Forum, and this is actually a charity which is set up to work with communities, both proactively and in the recovery phase following flooding and coastal erosion, just to help people get back up on their feet, to help communities recover from flooding and coastal change with practical advice, and also helping to build the resilience of communities by things like establishing flood wardens, which you can see on the bottom there, basically creating flood action groups that can have some sort of sense of control and sense of action, if you like, when flooding and coastal change happens. In the top right, we also help communities prepare and respond by providing national flood alerts and warnings. So we have really good coverage of flood alerts and warnings from across the country, a team of people responsible for maintaining it. And most people in the Environment Agency also serve a voluntary flood response or recovery position when there is significant local or national flood events in the country. So that was just a bit of a snapshot about some of the national things we're doing as Environment Agency on planning for adaptation and resilience, but then also some of the things, practical measures that communities can take when trying to look at their own flooding and coastal erosion risk and how to take action. Some takeaways though. I think uncertainty is often banded around when we're looking at future climate change and plans for adaptation, but uncertainty in itself should not be an excuse for inaction. There's still plenty of things that we can do, even though the extent, the timing and impact of climate change is uncertain. Also, communicating future climate impacts is definitely fraught with challenge. I think don't underestimate the time needed to engage with communities to bring them along that change curve so they understand what flooding and coastal change impacts might mean for them now and what it might mean for the future. You also need to engineer the space for community discussion and deliberation on how their places should adapt to climate impacts. And certainly the learning from the community panels, the citizens' juries have been instrumental in helping us understand how to have that conversation. Also, local leadership is key to getting meaningful action. So bringing in the role of local elected members, councillors, even your MPs in certain decisions can really help to amplify the plight of certain communities. But the final thing is also that framing action in communities in the context of resilience can actually unlock wider economic and wider social and environmental impacts and benefits that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to achieve by just focusing narrowly on trying to focus on flood protection, like building sea defences or flood walls. I'll hand back to you, Simon.
Andrew, thank you very much for that. I hope you can hear the applause. Excellent. That was absolutely fascinating. What we're going to do now is go into the question answer session, and we're going to start with the Slido questions. And I think probably the easiest way, we'll do 2 or 3 of those, but if you have a burning question and you haven't got Slido, then put your hand up, but you won't be heard unless we can get a microphone to you. So wave your hand around and be patient. But I think this will keep us entertained for a while. So, indeed. Bryce, welcome.
Good evening.
Hello, Bryce.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can. I'd like to introduce Bryce, who is not a speaker this evening, but he is from IAG New Zealand. You're in the corporate area, but I cannot remember exactly what you do,
Corporate
Bryce.
Relations.
Thank you. Because some of the questions here, you've had a UK insurance company, and what they do is in the UK, it may well lead to insurance companies, insurance questions from us here. And Bryce has very, very kindly agreed to be present as part of the panel. So maybe the next stage is, can the panel please reform? Oh, yep. Lovely. Thank you. So we have 2 members of the panel that are here, and we have 2 members of the panel who are not here. Now, unfortunately, you can't all be around a table, so you can't see each other necessarily, but where are we? I'd like to start with the top question. Westport, what are some of the positive aspects of being built into the master plan? Sorry, what are some of the positive aspects being built into the master planning process?
Right, where to begin really? So Westport's infrastructure is really old and dated. So part of that master planning looks at current state. The commercial district has a lot of work as well in terms of revitalisation works.
I'm sorry, for the members of the panel not here, can you hear this?
Yes, yep,
Okay,
good.
please carry on.
So current infrastructure, state, commercial centre, one of the things that happened after the floods as well, there was a really big argument between the building fraternity and the council about finished floor heights, etc., etc. So we're taking the community, having a conversation about holistically what is good for the community. So we haven't predetermined outcomes of master planning either. That's one kind of caveat I'll put in there. So we're about halfway through and we're in the exploration phase at the moment. So part of it is around current state of Westport. How do we better the situation of where we are? But then it's starting to unlock that potential essentially on the other side of the Buller River. How do we bring population drivers through if that is something that the community wants to see as well? So it's quite wide ranging and a bit of a waffly response, but that's because we haven't actually finished a master plan yet either.
Thank you. To our UK, well, actually, to the people not here, I do understand that Buller may not be part of your immediate universe, but do the sort of actions that you've heard about this evening ring bells with what you're doing in the UK? Over.
I don't mind sort of picking that up. I can probably describe a general good approach, if you like, to encouraging a conversation on how communities should adapt to the threat of flooding and coastal change. We have, through our Coastal Transition Accelerator program, we've investing £36 million in 5 local places across the country investigating coastal transition, but they all start with the engagement with communities at a local scale to understand what their wants and aspirations might be for the future. Unless you can do that, then you're gonna have a pretty bumpy ride trying to sort of have implement, if you like, those actions to roll back communities. Interestingly, what we are doing in the places like East Riding and North Norfolk is they're communities that are actually experiencing losses right now. So they're dealing with the impacts of climate change right now. They're not just planning for the future. But we've essentially given them funding to develop coastal transition plans, which will be integrated into the local development framework. So the spatial plan, if you like, locally, to try and make use of the transitional use of land, if you like, in coastal erosion zones. So, pulling away where we've got houses and sensitive infrastructure of the coast, and then using that for less vulnerable, less sensitive uses, where there's still utility, there's still potential economic value from the land, but it can be used in a more sensitive way. But then also looking at sort of other aspects like the use of modular construction, so houses can literally roll back, community infrastructure can literally roll back over time, and also looking at potential relaxation of planning rules locally by the council to encourage, if you like, a more thriving community. So I think the principles that were sort of shared by Paul are principles that we also share in the UK, albeit I can't say it's implemented the same everywhere in every single space in the UK, but through these particular pilot locations, we are experimenting.
Thank you. Any other comments or thoughts before we go to the next question from anybody?
Well, I'll just jump in there if I may. I think the one of the important things we need to be thinking about is how do we do all that planning ahead of time. I think Westport got nailed and faced a number of kind of events that kept threatening the community, and it would have been great to be able to swing into action with a plan. It would have been even better to kind of avoid that damage in the first place. So we see communities around the country. Westport, I think South Dunedin's got a really good process going. We've seen work in the Hawke's Bay and some of the work that they've done around their coastal plan. Some communities are starting to think about this. We need more communities to do that. So we need to think about how we take these processes, learn and incubate them in other communities. And then we also need to think about how do we give effect to them practically. Because I think one of the challenges we saw in the Hawke's Bay, if I understand it correctly, is that they did their planning and thinking quite a long time ago, but what they struggled with was how do you actually put that into action? What are the tools we need to take the community decisions and give effect to them, not only within this year or within this kind of council cycle, but over many years many councils, many governments, many decades, so that actually the plan starts to roll out. So that's, I think, once you get the community planning, I think giving effect to it becomes the next challenge that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you. The next question down, because people have been voting on these, which is why they're up. And if you want questions up, which are lower down, please vote on them. I'm afraid, Megan, this has got to be yours. Given existing legislation, sorry, no, where? Yes, sorry. Is there an appetite for the inquiry on adaptation? Well, you can read it yourself.
Thank you. And I'd just like to, since last time I had the microphone, acknowledge Reuben Davidson, the local MP, who's come in here, and I know he has a huge interest in this, and Alex Hewison, a local board member, both of whom I know are very interested in this question. In terms of whether or not there is an appetite within the inquiry for a specific agency to lead it, I'd say the jury's out on that, and there's a number of reasons. I think here in Canterbury, we know what a centralised agency can look like, the Canterbury Earthquake Response Authority, that when you're trying to kind of shimmy all the bits of government to work together to get out of their silos, it can be incredibly difficult, and a central agency can be very useful. We cobbled together something similar after Gabriel, but not with the same permanence in terms of how it is that you coordinate across government. I think for me, the critical bits that we have to ensure that we've got clarity on is clarity of roles and responsibilities. What I addressed in my first talk, that it's still so unclear who's doing what. Whether or not we need a central agency to ensure that we have that clarity, I think is a question we haven't got to yet. So I'm not ruling it in or ruling it out. The other thing is that we have to have those questions and that around data and who is collecting, holding the data is going to be one of the central issues. And I think, Bryce, that's probably something the insurance industry will be really interested in as well, because obviously the insurance industry is one of the key collectors of data around risk in the country. So how we put all that together, is it a database of national significance? Is it held by Land Information New Zealand? We've seen what's happened when councils have tried to be the purveyors of this data and put it on the land information memorandums. Things have ended up in court, so and have been rolled back. So there's a whole complexity of things that have to be worked through there. But also it goes back to funding. It's is the best way to make sure we're getting the funding where it's going to be needed through a centralised agency, or just having a very clear framework across government of who does what and who is accountable for what.
Thank you. Any comments from elsewhere in the room?
Yeah, well, I'll just quickly add on to that. I was part of the expert working group that looked into managed retreat, and the adage we kind of had there when we think about institutions was, form follows function. So what is it, what is it that we need to do, and where are those activities best take place? And I think we'll get different answers for different parts of it. I think, we just, in the previous question, we talked about the importance of making sure that these things are locally led and therefore perhaps centrally enabled. But there are still things that we will need to do and perhaps can only do centrally. And so I think Megan's right. It's about working out what are those tasks and activities that we need to be doing, and actually where's the most sensible place for them to occur. So it's an inevitable question we'll have to answer. And as a working group, we came up with, as part of the report, there was, a series of recommendations in there that did include some institutional form elements.
If I may, I just present a English perspective here on some of the barriers for what we're talking about here, which is adaptation and enabling transition or managed retreat. So same thing, different language there. But one of the issues that we have in England is actually, how do you fund adaptation, but how do you assess the economic value of adaptation, which is essentially what is the value of flexibility? And some of the issues that we have is that often our way of assessing the economic benefits based on net present value favours these more traditional hard engineer solutions, but they're actually fundamentally inflexible, unadaptable solutions, which are very costly and often provide a higher level of protection early on in their life before you need it, and then what happens in the future creates sort of legacy. It also sometimes creates more difficult problems to deal with in the future, where more sensitive land uses sort of occur behind defences or behind coastal defences, and then you've got to protect more infrastructure. So by building these sort of hard engineered solutions, it can actually makes the problem worse, if you like, to try and encourage managed retreat or transition in the future. And, you know, if you actually incorporate transition managed retreat into the local spatial planning process properly and have the right development zoning, then you can actually get to a state where this is just land use management. This is just essentially having strong land use management and strong safeguards in place to ensure that you are transitioning at a rate which is matching, if you like, the rate of change from coastal transition adaptation. Now, I'm massively oversimplifying it there. There's obviously going to be issues where you've got sort of historical land uses and other things and complexities on the coast where that's going to be really challenging. But it comes down to good planning.
Certainly.
Thank you. Any other? Yes. Oh, sorry. Hang on. We need to get the microphone to you first, because otherwise you won't be heard.
Why is New Zealand so far behind?
Actually, I agree with you, but I'm not answering the question. Anybody like to come with an answer? Oh, okay.
I think certainly when we compare with what we've been hearing about the UK, I think we can say that there's a lot of stuff we need to do. I think there is, I don't want anyone to leave tonight thinking there is no work underway in this space. Bryce talked about a piece of work that he sat on, which was the expert working group on managed retreat, which was part of the building blocks for what was going to be the third year of the RM reform. Bryce, just to reassure you, that is going to be taken into account by the FEC inquiry. You'll be very pleased to know. So there is a lot of work that has been going on in terms of getting there. I think one of the issues that New Zealand has that makes it a bit different is that we have leaned in a lot into our EQC system, which in itself is quite unique when we've come to do disaster recovery. So what we've seen is, I think that people have seen that they've seen what happened in Canterbury after the earthquakes. They've assumed there's going to be a replication in terms of how EQC. Now, EQC can have a very small part to play. I think what we heard in terms of the flood RE is something that's starting to look like an expansion of what a public insurance scheme in that system would look like. And I think there is huge scope for how we can expand our institutions that we already have. So a lot of what we heard in terms of the flood RE reminded me a lot of what the Californian Earthquake Commission does, which actually gives money to homeowners to prepare for earthquakes before they happen, rather than fixing them up after the fact. So I think actually we've got a lot of the bones there in terms of what needs to happen. I think a lot of what sits behind why we haven't progressed things is the funding and financing question, as it often is, follow the money. I think that the work around the future for local government and how it is that local government is funded and what the roles and responsibilities are in there is something we also have to solve. Because while we have kind of patch wars between central and local government, we will never get anywhere in terms of what we need to do here. There's got to be that clarity of roles, but that has to be followed by money.
Yeah, and can I just extend what Megan's saying there? I think one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but flooding is your major peril in the UK, right? That's the biggest one, and by order of magnitude, or just significantly bigger?
Significant.
Okay. So in New Zealand, our major peril, and by an order of magnitude, is earthquake. And so we've spent as a country a lot of time understanding that risk, making sure that it's properly reflected in building code and resilience standards, that we have the right models, that we have the right institutional arrangements like the EQC. It dominates our reinsurance programs. It dominates our pricing of insurance. So we focused a lot, and we're pretty good at managing earthquakes. And what in their shadow, we've had these kind of weather events, and typically they've been few and small. And what we are seeing, and what we need to play catch up with, is the fact that they are growing. Both there's a trend in there and they're becoming much more frequent, but there's a volatility in there and they're becoming much larger. So I think when we compare ourselves, if you're comparing our flood response to the UK's flood response, it's a slightly unfair comparison when you're comparing perhaps our secondary peril by a long way to their primary peril. So they would have been focusing on that for a very, very long time. We've been focusing on earthquake for a very long time, but I agree with your point. We've got to be moving a lot faster than we are to understand this, to get the data, to start making these decisions about role, about funding. And there's some really difficult political questions that Megan and her colleagues have to answer before we can really start to make progress, which is why the FEC inquiry is so incredibly important. But we're expecting an acceleration over the next couple of years.
Simon, I wonder whether I've kind of done a bit of a disservice by saying we solved all the problems in England. We absolutely haven't. We still have sort of, over 2.5 million properties at risk of surface water flooding. 700 properties are going to fall into the sea in the next 20 years. And just to sort of flag a few things that Jonathan raised, Flood Re, he did say it is a good thing, but it is time limited. It comes to an end in 2039. The assumption of Flood Re is that the government development planning process, policy, etc., basically makes sure that no development gets in the floodplain, and through the installation of property flood resilience and other sort of conventional defence measures, protects properties. Now that's a heroic assumption, but in 2039 Flood Re ceases to be, and it was only there to be basically a marketable insurance product that could provide sort of discounted flood insurance to people. I don't know what happens after 2039. The other thing is that in the UK we have no funding mechanism for coastal loss. Just let that sink in. So in other locations where you get big sort of coastal erosion events across the world, most countries that have a mechanism actually just pay for it from central government. We do not have that in England. So if you lose your house, there's no kind of guarantee mechanism of actually getting the value back for that property. There's no sort of payment mechanism. There's no compensation mechanism that's provided by government. You may get some money from the council to help with the demolition costs. But that's it. So we haven't got it sorted. And certainly that's one of the reasons why we have the Coastal Transition Accelerator Programme, to see whether there are other mechanisms at play to enable that transition to happen in a more equitable way for communities.
Thank you. There's a lot of food for thought here, and I'm aware that I'm being like a gadfly, but the list of questions have been ranked by you and asked by you. So can we move on to the next one? I'm aware we have probably about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get through some of these, but after this event, we will have all of these questions and we will put them on our website or think of some way of proceeding the discussion. So how does New Zealand turn attention to climate change in the face of poverty, inequity, crime, and health? You're a brave lady.
No, not at all, because actually they're not separate. Unless we address the issues and the risks around both mitigation and adaptation with climate change, we will increase inequality, we will increase poverty, we will not take all the opportunities we can as a country. And if you want to attack the drivers of crime, you address things like health, poverty, and inequality. So unless we grasp the nettle on these issues, we are setting ourselves up not only for climate problems and people having issues around their properties, that we actually start to weaken the social fabric of our country. So it's not a nice to do, it's something we have to, and we have to think about it across all of our policy that we're putting together.
Any other comments on that? Oh. You'll need a microphone. Okay.
How are you going to do that with a climate denier like Shane Jones?
Oh, there's an election in 2 years.
Okay. Shall we go to the next question now, which is, given existing legislation, how come urban development has encroached so far into the risky areas? This might be what you spoke about at the beginning about a patchwork, but I won't answer the question. I'll just ask it. Anybody?
The Resource Management Act specifically has a provision to exclude climate change. Stupidly, and it has never been repealed.
Correct.
No, and this is exactly why that we have to have this bespoke framework, that trying to fit those things together in terms of the guidance that is given from the Resource Management Act through to local bodies to make decisions is not fit for purpose when it comes for this. We have to have an explicit framework. We have to make sure that when we're doing greenfields developments, that we are not putting them into places that we know in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, they're going to be flood prone. So that we have had a regime that has been far too permissive. It has not taken into account the climate risks. And the job ahead of us is to put in place a framework that does. And that is exactly what the inquiry is looking at the moment. The other one in the I'm just going to leap to the next one to answer for you as well. Is human-induced climate change a natural hazard in law? No, it's not. But the forms in which we see climate change occurring, flood, fire, landslips, those kinds of natural hazards, they are in law. But the category of human-induced climate change isn't. The consequences are.
I will add something to that. And I need to be careful quite how I say it. Some of these issues, when I was research manager and deputy to Jan Wright as parliamentary commissioner, we actually were considered, okay, so the RMA does not include climate change. And we recognise that there was real issue there. But in the end, and this is maybe, there were so many other things which seemed almost more urgent that we never got to it until a bit later. And obviously, we get to it.
The three pieces of RM reform, there was the Spatial Planning Act, and then there was the RM replacement, but the third pillar is the one that never got enacted, which is the climate adaptation framework. This is what was stopped when this government got rid of the RM reform program we were on and are replacing it with their own. The inquiry that we're doing now is looking to fill that space, but it was always the intention that that third pillar of the RM reform would take that into account.
Indeed. Okay. Go for it. You need a microphone. Hang on.
In the RMA, under other matters, it says in achieving the purpose of this Act, all persons exercising function and powers under it in relation, blah, 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 shall have particular regard to the effects of climate change. So I think we just have to be really careful that we make sure that what we're discussing is factual. So please read the Act.
Okay. Back there. Thank you. Okay. I'm aware time is short. I'm going to suggest we go for Colin. It's got to be you, Colin Merck. Is it? We go for Colin's question next, and then the innovative approaches. But anyway, Colin, you asked a question. The microphone's coming towards you. I don't know there are going to be very many answers for it.
Is it unreadable? I mean, I just posed the question that The world can't support the present population with the material consumption and this belief in infinite growth. But how do we change that narrative in a way that brings everyone along on the journey to alternative values, i.e., village, human, creativity, nature, etc., from a endless material consumption sort of value system, because it seems like that's necessary. And I guess a related question, which is not up there, is how does private property, is it fit for purpose in dealing with these random, chaotic events that are going to hit us in the future? How can we possibly, compensate losses by paying out market values for property rather than just resettling people on nationalised land?
That was one of his questions lower down, so he's got 2 for 1.
I would expect nothing less from you, Colin. Okay, go on then. Thank you.
Great question, Colin. I wouldn't expect anything less. And I actually think something that we started in government is incredibly important to continue with, and it's about wellbeing budgets, where we're reporting on things other than gross domestic product, that we measure our wealth as a country and what we're doing with child poverty, that we measure our wealth as a country and how we're caring for our environment. But more importantly, we report on it, that it's just as important as the Crown accounts when they're tabled. And some of you may know that one of the measures that we introduced in government and Grant Robertson did was that with every budget there now has to be a report on how we're performing against child poverty measures, as well as what the Crown accounts are looking like. So it's about reporting and measuring as well, Colin.
Can I come in there, Simon? Just was one comment. So sorry,
Please
I'm
do.
in the room. So it's a massive question, but I think I'm minded of the fact that we spoke a lot about community in a lot of these presentations. I spoke a lot about community, and I think there's 2 things: community and action. So by having that conversation with communities, by having a conversation about what matters to them, beyond just the kind of narrow focus on the climate impact and what it might mean for infrastructure or economy, find out what it means to those individuals. And just having that conversation can often unlock, if you like, those wider aspects of resilience, social resilience, for example, that we might be able to sort of capture and measure and deliver solutions that don't just benefit from a flood and coastal risk management perspective, but then provide that wider benefit moreover. I think that can really help, if you like, to try and shift the conversation. One of the things that we've also done in England is we've invested in looking at the concept of resilience, how you might measure resilience over time. And we've actually pointed to the fact that when looking at flood and coastal risk management solutions, both current and future, you need to look at the socio-demographic indicators which contribute either as an enabler or a disenabler of delivering flood and coastal resilience. So we've, in fact, today I've just had socio-demographic indicators for essentially very, very detailed communities across the country for the entirety of England, which we're now going to see how we can sort of integrate into our decision making when we're looking at future schemes. Yeah, kind of exciting in a way. Gets us away from a narrow focus on net present value and cost benefit. But ultimately, funding needs to change if we're going to be trying to deliver these outcomes in terms of, reducing social vulnerability, etc. Then we need to make sure the funding is aligned and enables us to do it.
Can I just jump in quickly? Sorry, just to build on both those points. The short answer is why we don't value those things in our decision making, right? If we valued those things, the social outcomes, the environmental outcomes, and we can find a way to factor those into our decision making, then they'll become relevant. At the moment, they're not. At the moment, it is NPV and it's financial, and so those other things that we intrinsically do value are not part of our decision making formally. And just to pick up on another point, the question you asked, about can we afford to pay people out market rates? I think the most obvious answer is no. And I mentioned earlier on, there's some really key decisions that Megan and her colleagues have to make. And one of those decisions is how big a haircut are we expecting private property owners to take? Because it's inevitable that they're going to have to.
Thank you. Right. Nobody can hear you online. What I'll do, if I may, because there are two linked questions there, I'm going to ask one question first, which will then lead into your questions, and then one other, because time is moving on. Okay, the question I want to ask is, and it's really to about New Zealand insurance. And I do appreciate that I may not be comparing like to like, and I do understand what you were saying earlier, but it does seem quite an innovative approach in the UK. And I wondered your feelings looking ahead with the New Zealand insurance sector about innovation. And I'll just leave it there. What do you think? Over.
I think there's two parts to that. One, we do have a very traditional but perhaps different set of insurance products here. It's ground up cover, all perils, so that's slightly different to other countries. But we do need to start thinking about different options, and the industry is doing that. You'll start to see, certainly for earthquake, you can start to see kind of parametric, which is a different type of insurance models coming in, and so there will be a lot of thinking going on. Certainly, there's within IAG about how we might think about our own products to make sure that they're still relevant and affordable and still provide value to customers. So that is happening, and the reason that's happening is because as these events become more frequent and more severe, then obviously the cost of insurance goes up, and that becomes problematic for people. And so we need to think about ways of keeping them insured. Ultimately, there will be parts of this country that cannot be insured, right? Places by the coast, when the waves are in your lounge, you're probably not going to be insured. That's a pretty simple thing to understand. But there's a need to think about how we manage the transition for people, which we've talked a lot about. But part of that transition is how do we keep them financially protected through continuing to be insured. And flood reason is not strictly for that purpose, but it is a mechanism to keep people insured while there's other solutions are found. It's one of a variety of schemes that exist around the world, each with their pros and cons. And when we've looked at that, we've basically said there's some things that we can learn from the UK. There's things that we can learn from the US, a variety of other countries about, and come up with something that's fit for purpose for New Zealand. I think we have the advantage of insurance still being widely available, broadly affordable for most. So we have an opportunity to get ahead of this problem. And the Treasury did look at this a few years ago. Minister Clark started looking at the question of do we need our own kind of flood risk scheme in New Zealand? IAG's answer then is probably our answer now. We don't need one now, but we need to be having the conversation. So I think that's the second level of innovation. How do we want to think about the market as a whole and the role it plays to keep people protected as these perils kind of get larger and larger? And we need to draw lessons from other countries and how they are addressing those issues, and whether that's a role for a different scheme, a different form of EQC, that these are all the kind of questions we need to think about.
I think probably the last question this evening. It's okay, because there is one particular thing here to do with people getting poorer and the impacts of losing your house.
Well, there's two sides to that question,
But-
isn't it? It's the people that are at risk and people like in Brooklands who actually want help. And then there's other people who live in places like Sumner, Redcliffs, parts of New Brighton, who aren't at risk or have a very low aspect of risk, who do get insurance because Bryce and the insurance companies are a bit smarter than the council and insure. So there's a number of people like me that has properties that have very low. Well, the council told us that we were going to be inundated, potential to have that. So they tried to put a hazard notice on our title. We went to MB, and the government and the government department, in their wisdom, agreed with the insurance company that we were right and there was no risk. So what I'd like to say is, can the government please ensure that local councils follow correct procedure and aren't just covering their backsides in respect to this, and are fair in their assessment of risk of flooding. Put the attention, pay most attention on those areas that want it, and leave others alone that don't.
Okay. Megan?
Just a quick comment to that. And look, I think that kind of sums up a number of those strands that I talked about in that knot, and one of which is data. And how it is and who integrates it, how we make sure that we're using common data sets across insurers, councils, government, and that we're not having kind of individual things kind of growing up. So when we talk about whether or not we need centralisation, and some things we do, because I think to have the conversation, and it's going to be a difficult conversation, let's not kid ourselves, but to have the conversation, I think we need to be starting with the same information. And I think that kind of draws in with what you're saying in terms of the ability to have those conversations. I think when people are sitting there with different information in front of them, it makes no sense. And I think that's one of the things I'm really keen that we get out of this inquiry, that we're all speaking the same language, at least when we sit at the table.
Yeah, and the Christchurch City Council, they engage consultants to give them the answers that they wanted. So if we had independent data from independent people, I think that would be a better situation. I agree with you. Thank you.
Also, Brighton doesn't get a competition because they don't listen. Our team doesn't get it.
Okay.
We don't just talking about Brighton, and we're talking about conversation and communications. How much communication is that Christchurch City Council give us? Very little.
I am going to jump in here, sorry,
Go on then.
because
Okay.
I always have a lot to say. I think one of the takeaways from tonight, this is so many people having that conversation. This is not just about the council. This is about how we bring multiple people together. And I think that the traditional way that we've thought about having these conversations, which probably raise a few hackles, I'm picking from what you're saying, is that what is the way of get ahead of this as a community? And I think you all coming here tonight is a great start to that. Don't wait for them to come and start the conversation. You can start the conversation.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I should just say a word about where we might go from here. Our website is under having rather serious surgery at the moment, poor thing. But these questions will go up there, and people wiser than I who delve in mysteries like Facebook and such like, we will push that out that way to keep this conversation happening. But for me now, it's my very happy job to say thank you to all of our speakers and our panel members. Thank you very much for your time. I'm also aware that some people came from Spencerville and far-flung places, having had to go to something else previously there to get here. Thank you. I think this is a useful type of discussion to have in a community, and I hope we will have more of these, obviously, but I hope that we can start having the more basic conversation amongst us about information, but about what the issues are. What is it? Leave no one behind. That's our goal. And that's going to be a hard one. But it's what we should be aiming for, I suggest. Anyway, thank you all very much. Good evening.